Hello and welcome. My name is Alan Love. I'm the director of the Minnesota Center for Philosophy of Science, and I am happy to bring you to our second International Postdoctoral Forum in Philosophy of Science event of the fall semester. Just a couple words about the program. The International Postdoc Forum was something that was established 2 years ago during the pandemic and was an opportunity for junior scholars to be able to present their work in the virtual format. And we have been excited with the response and have decided to continue with that program going on, assuming that the pandemic is fading to some degree at least, but for sure we are able to continue in this virtual format given the enthusiastic response we've had. So today it's my pleasure to introduce Duygu Uygun Tunç, who is coming to us from the Philosophy and Ethics Unit at Eindhoven University of Technology. And the topic of her presentation will be, what is an informative replication? And before I turn things over to Duygu, let me just remind everyone that after the initial presentation, Sarah Volz will give a commentary and I will introduce that, and then we will have an opportunity for general question and answer after that point. So with that, let me turn the floor over to you, Duygu, to present to us what is an informative replication.
Thank you very much, Ellen, and welcome to everyone. First of all, it's a great honor to be in Paul Mills Institution for me, actually, which who would also have lots to say on the rare topic I'm going to talk about today. So thank you very much once again for the invitation. So without further ado, I will maybe start with sharing my screen and we can take it from there. Just a second. So, yep. So now I should, yep, it should work now. Yes, sorry for the wait. So yes. So the title, as Ellen said, is what is an informative replication? So there has been quite a number of very good sort of talks and debates on the general issue of replication in this institution. So I'm also happy to continue a little bit on the theme of that debate. So the general overview of today's presentation is building my way to defining a replication. So that's my ultimate goal, but I will take a rather roundabout way. First, I'm going to propose a novel perspective on the severity of a hypothesis test, because I will reach my goal through my sort of account of severity, and that accounts of severity would be grounded in a certain understanding of the problem of underdetermination. And a sort of a methodological and pragmatic approach to how to sort of tackle it in scientific practice. So I will, after talking about the problem of underdetermination, I will sort of propose my account of severity as epistemic risk management. And then after that retour, I will try to define the epistemic function of replication studies. And from that functional basis, I will try to formulate a definition of replications and again a potential sort of taxonomic guideline to sort of categorize different kinds of replications. And in the very end, I will also like sort of mention a little bit previous work an example or an application of this general perspective to a replication strategy that we proposed earlier. So let me begin. So as most of you would be somewhat familiar, there's an ongoing debate in mostly the social, behavioral, and life sciences about the low replicability of studies in numerous areas, like commonly called the replication or replicability crisis. And this is obviously discouraging news for the practicing scientists in these fields because replication studies are widely regarded as one of the benchmarks of scientific rigor. But this diagnosis of a replicability crisis led almost simultaneously also to a reflection on what replicability means and how to interpret replication failures. And as matters stand, there's still, I can say, a vast disagreement as to what makes a study a replication of another, or what function replications actually serve, and what kind of replication studies can there be. And it seems to be evident that this meta-scientific debate cannot theoretically progress really if it doesn't conceptually ground the meaning of a replication beyond the ambiguous notions of similarity and dissimilarity to the original study. And in this talk, I will propose a general account of replication, which I hope will be fruitful from a novel perspective on the severity of a hypothesis test. So to begin, so there are mainly three questions that shape the debate on replication. So pertaining to its definition, its function, and pertaining to the taxonomy of replications. And I believe that our starting point should be the epistemic function of a replication study, because once we specify the function of a replication, we can develop a definition as well as a taxonomy of replications on that basis. But starting from the question of function is also worthwhile because replications are not valuable in themselves. They can generate information only relative to certain scientific aims or goals related to hypothesis testing in general. And I propose that the scientific aim that replications serve should be conceived as severity. And the concept of severity is similarly a bit vague, though less so than that of a replication. So I will work towards defining a replication through formulating a general and applicable account of severity. So to give a taste of the main idea, I specify the function of a replication as minimizing the epistemic risks of erroneously or falsely rejecting or maintaining a hypothesis and across multiple tests. And this is tantamount, I will argue, to increase test severity across multiple studies. I will unpack this formulation via several steps. I will begin with my theoretical perspective on the severity that I proposed. So conceived most generally, severity, I guess, can be defined as the capacity of a test to confirm empirical support to a hypothesis and relative to its alternatives. And if you follow this definition, we first see that severity assessment might address two different questions. So first is whether a test is able to lend any empirical support to a hypothesis. And second, how much extra empirical support it lends to a hypothesis vis-a-vis its alternatives. And answering both of these questions enables us to assess whether and to what extent that test is a reliable and informative test of that hypothesis. From the perspective I will propose, the strategies to make this assessment is tantamount to solving the problem of underdetermination as defined in the philosophy of science. Because the severity of a hypothesis test, or its capacity to confer empirical support to a hypothesis relative to its alternatives, is inversely related to the underdetermination of that hypothesis by test results. So, in a nutshell, we lose severity to the extent that the test results underdetermine the hypothesis, and by consequence, we can increase severity, hopefully, by reducing underdetermination. And I will now elaborate on this account of severity and how it works. But let me first mention very briefly the source of inspiration behind it. My account of severity has four main sources along with previous work on the topic, namely Popper's original notion of severity, obviously, Deborah Mayo's error statistical concept of test severity, Paul Meehl's notion of actuarial judgment, and last but not least, Aude Mautman's gradational notion of underdetermination. So start with Popper. As well known, according to Popper, the severity of a test is its ability to falsify a theory, which in turn is defined as a result of the degree of the testability of the theory. So the downside of this conception is that it is very downsided because, like, just remember in the previous slide, I said severity assessment addresses actually two different questions. So Popper's conception is one-sided because it can be used to tell how much extra empirical support would a test potentially lend to a hypothesis on a logical plane, but not to assess if and to what extent a test was actually severe. So it serves the second goal, but not the first goal. So Deborah Mayo took this concept and applied it to statistical inference and arguably overcame this one-sidedness problem. So Mayo defines severity as a measure of how a test prevents erroneous interpretations of the results. So a test will not render any empirical support to a hypothesis if it does not reduce certain frequentist error probabilities below a threshold of acceptability. And assessing this in turn can give us a measure of the relative empirical support of alternative hypotheses if we compare their respective error rates. However, statistical test severity cannot realize what Popper originally intended, namely evaluating the empirical support of theoretical or substantial hypotheses. This is because statistical test severity is only a component of the severity of a hypothesis test, actually. So my third component is Mill's actuarial judgment. This term originally refers to a statistical prediction procedure in the clinical context. So it is a prediction scheme that maximizes the expected utility by minimizing expected relative costs of false positive versus false negative predictions for a relevant stakeholder. And Mail did not apply this notion to hypothesis testing per se, but we already know that he analyzed hypothesis tests in terms of a bundle of hypotheses consisting of the main and the auxiliary hypotheses, and approached the underdetermination problem from a methodological and pragmatic perspective. So by connecting these two approaches of Mail, the notion of actuarial judgment can be very broadly applied to the context of severity assessment. So that's the idea. According to this, we can conceive severity in terms of epistemic risks due to erroneously abandoning or maintaining a hypothesis, where the source of error would be conceptualized as the underdetermination of the hypothesis by the findings. So finally, the youngest and the least famous of this bunch, Adam Altman has offered an understanding of underdetermination as a gradational concept, and it really nicely complements my epistemic risk management approach inspired by Mill by grounding the degree of the relevant kind of risk in the degrees of the relevant kind of underdetermination. So instead of conceiving underdetermination as a binary concept, which means like certain falsification or confirmation versus underdetermination, we can talk about relative degrees of underdetermination. So after this little retour, coming back to my claim that devising a strategy to make severity assessment is tantamount to solving the problem of underdetermination, an obvious question is, how would this work? Because the problem of underdetermination is actually intractable. So the problem is traditionally formulated logically as an intractable problem, and it refers to the impossibility of conclusively refuting or verifying hypotheses on the basis of empirical evidence. Then it has two distinct but interrelated aspects, and the terminology or the distinction is due to Kyle Stanford. Holistic underdetermination, or what is often called Duhem's problem, refers to the ambiguity of falsifications, and the thesis goes, given that we must make various auxiliary assumptions in formulating and testing hypotheses, no test can allocate blame uniquely to the hypothesis under test. On the other hand, contrastive underdetermination refers to the inability of a test to uniquely support a hypothesis. So the thesis goes, given that no hypothesis can be entailed by evidence, the results can support multiple alternative hypotheses at once. So let's illustrate these two problems. My examples usually come from psychology because that's what I'm familiar with. So let's say we are testing a theory concerning intelligence and social class link. And we would first need to define how intelligence and social class would look like in the real world. For example, intelligence can look like academic aptitude, and it can be hypothetically measured through SAT scores, or social class can look like control over means of production and can be measured through, let's say, occupation. So we then need to create a suitable observational setting to test the conjectured relationship between these variables. And finally, we need various strategies to transform the data into what we call the findings. And this whole process requires us to make various assumptions, traditionally called auxiliary hypotheses. These auxiliary assumptions range from the reliability of the instruments that we use, the accuracy of our measurements, the validity of our operationalizations of our theoretical or conceptual terms, our statistical assumptions like random sampling or the normality of the data distribution, to the implications of previous theories, and obviously the notorious ceteris paribus clause, which means like all other unaccounted for factors are like equal or insignificant. In this regard, actually to every isolated empirical test, we pose several largely independent questions, and we pose them simultaneously. So for instance, when we are testing the question, does intelligence predict social class? We also test questions such as, does academic aptitude reflect intelligence, or does occupation capture social class? Do SAT scores measure academic aptitude? Do SAT scores have adequate reliability? Or is test familiarity a problem in studying this phenomenon? And so on. And to all, we receive just a single answer from a hypothesis test. Are it like a yes or no? For this reason, especially when we receive a no, it is necessarily ambiguous. So we cannot ascertain from the single test and its results if the hypothesis under test or one or more of our auxiliary hypotheses should really bear the burden of falsification. And contrastive underdetermination can also be illustrated through the same example, and it's easier actually to imagine. Let's say we have a positive correlation between SAT scores and occupation, but these results can be explained by numerous different theories, as you can imagine. And some of these theories can be even mutually contradictory in lots of other respects. So strictly logical versions of the underdetermination thesis are intractable, as I said, because it is basically impossible to explicitly state and test all potentially infinite auxiliary assumptions made in hypothesis formulation and test design. But scientists luckily have not only logical, but also methodological tools for increasing the informational value of the tests they design. So we can reconstruct the logical problem of underdetermination as a methodological problem. And the methodological problem of holistic underdetermination would be something like how to allocate the impact of the negative results between a hypothesis and various auxiliary assumptions that are made in designing its test. And the methodological problem of contrastive underdetermination is that of identifying rational criteria for preference between a given number of rival hypotheses that are compatible with the same evidence. So once we reformulate underdetermination as a methodological problem, as a further step, we can approach it pragmatically, namely in terms of the management of various epistemic risks. So let us apply to these considerations to the concept of severity. I propose that increasing severity means managing epistemic risks due to holistic and contrastive underdetermination. And since underdetermination itself is a multifaceted phenomenon, and it invites a plurality of methodological strategies, severity is actually a multifaceted property. So we should speak at least of two senses of severity, holistic and contrastive severity. I will just temporarily call these. So increasing holistic severity or reducing holistic underdetermination reduces the risks of falsely rejecting or maintaining the hypothesis due to false auxiliary assumptions or a false ceteris paribus clause. And reducing contrastive underdetermination reduces the risk of misallocating empirical support among rival hypotheses. And managing both of these epistemic risks maximizes the informativity of our hypothesis tests. So the idea is that when a hypothesis test is informative, both negative and positive or corroborative and non-corroborative evidence teaches us important things about the underlying assumptions as well as the alternative hypotheses. So back to replications. Replications aim to increase severity across multiple tests, and they do so by reducing epistemic risks due to underdetermination. And replication studies and their informativity have chiefly to do with the problem of holistic underdetermination, although not exclusively. For this reason, I will dwell mostly on this aspect. So replications reduce risks due to holistic underdetermination by revealing if the corroboration or refutation of a hypothesis is conditional on certain auxiliary assumptions. So from this perspective, we can say that an informative replication of a test, an informative replication, is a test of certain alternative explanations of the findings that would be associated with certain auxiliary assumptions of the original test. So to be able to reduce epistemic risks due to holistic underdetermination, we should see how these risks arise in the first place. So risks due to holistic underdetermination increase to the extent that the scientific model is misspecified. And this means that one or more auxiliary assumptions are falsely relegated to the ceteris paribus clause, or the test features false or mutually contradictory assumptions. In this respect, holistic severity is a function of how difficult it is to provide alternative explanations of the test results in reference to false or contradictory auxiliary assumptions. In this framework, the problem of underdetermination can be conceived as a misspecification problem regarding the scientific model that is being tested. And what I call the scientific model minimally involves the main hypothesis, various auxiliary hypotheses, and a ceteris paribus clause. And the epistemic risk posed by misspecification would decrease to the extent that the test design explicitly specifies the auxiliary assumptions that are made in deriving the predictions, and the specified auxiliary assumptions are independently tested, and the factors identified by the auxiliary assumptions are effectively controlled or monitored, or at least otherwise checked in the execution of the test. So just a few words on the distinction between auxiliary hypotheses and the ceteris paribus clause. So scientists rationally expect only a certain subgroup of all their auxiliary assumptions to meaningfully impact the results, although there are infinitely many other auxiliary assumptions. So all these other auxiliary assumptions that presumably do not exert a meaningful enough influence on the results due to being completely inconsequential or only barely consequential so that their influence can be safely ignored, or coinciding with opposing factors that always nullify the potential effect, and so forth. So all these are thought to belong to this category, are relegated to the ceteris paribus clause. And as long as they are deemed to belong to the ceteris paribus clause, they are not explicitly stated, so they are not tested. They are just tentatively accepted as they are. And all the remaining auxiliary assumptions, such as like the reliability of the measures used in the study, whether the variables are operationalized in a way that is true to the theoretical construct, which means accurate and exhaustive, and various other factors that are associated with sample and treatments interactions, like if measures are appropriate to be used in a particular cultural context, for instance. All these are crucially influential in testing the main hypothesis, and the design elements, including our statistical analysis strategy, would be featured in a, let's say, very well-written method section of a scientific paper. So all that belongs there is what I call auxiliary assumptions specifically, and all the rest is just relegated to the ceteris paribus clause. So auxiliary hypotheses can be sorted to different levels because hypothesis testing involves actually specifying three models. We are actually testing a statistical hypothesis only, but this is sort of an index for all the higher level hypotheses that we intend to test. So we infer conclusions about a theoretical claim, which also has been operationalized in the form of an experimental or substantive hypothesis. So what I call the scientific model is a combination of the theoretical, experimental, and the statistical models. And this figure is to illustrate that, and it's from a previous paper. So, like very briefly, the theoretical model is used to specify a state of the world in which the predictions of the theory would hold. And besides the axioms or the theoretical core of the theory, theoretical models typically require researchers to accept other theories to drive their theoretical predictions. For instance, like if you have a theory about human memory, that might require accepting a theory about perception or attention. So theoretical models might also require certain factual assumptions when specifying their boundary conditions. And the experimental model would comprise criteria for the design and analysis of experiments. So at this level, researchers need to make an additional set of auxiliary assumptions concerning their theories of measurement, absence of confounding factors, and as I said, the ceteris paribus conditions. So finally, the data model comes with additional what we call statistical auxiliary assumptions, such as assumptions about how the data might be realized, like normally distributed data, and so on. So in the imaginary case of a crucial experiment, the theoretical model would be or the scientific model completely would be specified correctly and elaborately. All auxiliary hypotheses would be independently tested and relegated to what Popper called the unproblematic background knowledge. And the ceteris paribus clause would be sufficiently valid. And in such an imaginary case, only the main hypothesis can be held to account for the test results. So no underdetermination. But crucial experiments are not possible. The background knowledge is never unproblematic. Because science basically progresses through demonstrating the falsity of its highly regarded theories and debunking its once celebrated experiments, and also a constant updating of what we call scientific facts. On top of this, we constantly further specify our theories, which requires that we constantly transfer items from the ceteris paribus clause to our theoretical and experimental models. And a complete specification of theories would thus require an omniscient perspective, which is categorically in opposition with the nature of scientific knowledge. And there are also field-specific challenges related to the problem of misspecification. In the social and behavioral sciences, for example, the theories are usually so loosely organized that they don't say much about how the measurements should be. And auxiliary assumptions are seldom independently testable due to being heavily theory-laden or very difficult to experimentally isolate. And researchers also have less control on the environment of inquiry. So especially in the social and behavioral sciences, but pretty much in any field of scientific research, it is very difficult to test all auxiliary assumptions independently and effectively control all the factors identified by those assumptions in the execution of the test. So for this reason, single tests should not be the paradigm of hypothesis testing in the first place. Replication studies are a much more viable way to increase severity across multiple tests than relying on single tests. So replication tests should be an integral or an essential part of hypothesis testing. That's the main idea. So how do replications help? So we can utilize mainly two types of probes, I would call, in investigating the possibility of misspecification. Thereby we would be able to decrease the epistemic risks due to holistic underdetermination and hopefully increase severity. So the first is the scientific model which I mean the main hypothesis plus the three main sets of auxiliary assumptions, the scientific model should be associated with relatively stable observations, and the boundary conditions of the theory should not be too limiting. Otherwise, we have a generalizability problem. So we can call these the stability probe and the boundary conditions probe. So the core function of replication studies, I argue, is to investigate the possibility of misspecification through mainly these two kinds of probes. And I will detail this in a bit. While I defend a normative account of replication, we can also say that one of the main functions of replication studies have always been tackling various aspects of the problem of underdetermination. So closed replications usually test auxiliary hypotheses such as the reliability of the instruments, or that the original finding is not a statistical fluke. And conceptual replications test like other kinds of auxiliaries, such as the ones that pertain to the operationalization of the variables of interest. But replication studies similarly underdetermine hypotheses if they're not conducted to test an alternative explanation of the results pertaining to particular auxiliary assumptions of the original test in a targeted manner. So as a result, conceptual replications as well as closed replications have been criticized from like different angles. Conceptual replications have been criticized because failures to replicate are relatively uninformative and susceptible to be easily brushed aside by the original author. They don't identify, conceptual replications by themselves, they don't identify if the differences between the two sets of results indicate a problem with the hypothesis or one of the novel auxiliary assumptions in the replication study. On the other hand, with conceptual replications, neither success nor failure provides actually sufficient evidence for reaching a verdict on the corroboration of the hypothesis, because due to misspecifications in the model, artifactual findings might be perfectly replicable, or a true effect might persistently elude us. So if this is the case, even we conduct an infinite number of closed replications, we would fail at identifying which auxiliary assumptions are erroneously included or excluded in the scientific model. So therefore, it is worthwhile to specify first which epistemic function or functions do we want the so-called closed or conceptual replications to serve, and then we can devise the replication studies in a way that maximizes those functions. So once we adopt the function-oriented perspective, we can also develop more meaningful and useful taxonomic distinctions under the two very broad categories of closed and conceptual. So let's zoom in a little bit. Stability probes investigate if the scientific model in the original study falsely relegated some potentially problematic auxiliary assumptions into the ceteris paribus clause, which means like hidden motivators, cultural context dependency, flair or the expertise of the researcher who originally conducted the study, and so on. So if this is the case, we wouldn't obtain stable results in subsequent tests of the same scientific model. And if you don't obtain, if you obtain conflicting results, the possible implications are, of course, firstly, that the non-corroborative findings in the replication might be due to type 2 error, and the higher power the closed replications, the less are the chances that this is true. But if this is not the case, a potential implication is that the scientific model in the original study is misspecified in terms of auxiliary assumptions that have been relegated to the ceteris paribus clause. Or the original corroborative finding might have been due to type 1 error, and our whole scientific model might be wrong, but the scientific model as a whole. So I mean the bundle of the main hypothesis along with various auxiliary assumptions. So we see that a stability probe cannot give us distinctive information about the main hypothesis alone, but only about the scientific model as a whole. So neither success nor failure in closed replications provides sufficient evidence for reaching a verdict on the corroboration of the hypothesis itself. To do that, we need more. It is necessary actually to conduct further tests which would allow us to identify if or to what extent the corroboration of the hypothesis is conditional on particular auxiliary assumptions. And this is practicable if further replications are conducted with the aim that they will have consequences for distinct auxiliary assumptions. And such an investigation of conditional relationships I call a boundary conditions probe. The discovery of conditional relationships between the main hypothesis and particular auxiliary assumptions might significantly delimit the application of the scientific claim, if not directly undermine it. And this is because a scientific claim whose corroboration is strictly dependent on particular auxiliary assumptions would only have a very limited theoretical and practical use. And from another angle, scientific claims also involve a claim to generalizability through specifying boundary conditions within which they are sort of predicted to hold. And if the boundary conditions turn out to be significantly more limited than what the claim originally implied, we can also say that the associated generalizability claim of the main hypothesis is falsified. And the so-called conceptual replications ideally serve as boundary conditions probes. And since multiple kinds of auxiliary assumptions are involved in testing a single hypothesis, a boundary conditions probe might have to consist of several replication studies that use samples from different kinds of populations, utilize a different operationalization or measure of a variable, are conducted in different experimental settings than in the original protocol, and so on and so forth. The informational value of these replication studies will be accumulative, since they will complement one another if they are strategically coordinated. In this regard, in most research scenarios, we can hardly identify a single study as the replication of another if we want replications to be informative about the stability of the observation and the boundary conditions of the hypothesis under test. So we would need several studies to realize this function of replications, like in the senses I specified. On the other hand, these two main functions can also guide a further taxonomy of replication studies, depending on which kind of auxiliary assumptions they would test. Let me finish with an example or a further sort of idea how we can, we think, the best sort of utilize the functions of replications or the stability and the boundary conditions probes. So we proposed earlier in this paper a systematic replications framework, which involves several stability and boundary conditions probes through interlinked replication studies. So SRF is a methodological procedure for investigating if the corroboration of the main hypothesis is conditional upon including or excluding certain auxiliary hypotheses in the test. So it consists in a systematically organized series of replications that function collectively as a single research line. So in this replication framework, we sort of represented auxiliary assumptions in two broad groups for simplicity. So one auxiliary assumption set that links the theoretical predictor to the observable predictor. Let's say we have just two variables. And one that links the theoretical outcome to the observational outcome. And a scientific model consists of these two sets of auxiliary assumptions along with the main hypothesis. So it is a testing framework with 6 distinct steps. The first and the second step consists of, in an original study and its close replications. So these can be several if needed. Next, a series of conceptual replications are conducted for testing individual elements from these auxiliary assumption sets, which are also followed by their associated closed replications to test again for stability. And these are steps 3 to 6. So in the first 2 steps, the same sets of auxiliary assumptions are being tested with different samples and unavoidable variations to the setting that are deemed theoretically irrelevant. And the second step would function as a stability probe, so the closed replications. From step 3 to 6, the predictor auxiliary set and the outcome auxiliary sets would be varied. So 3 and 5 would be the boundary conditions probes. And these steps can involve, as I said, similarly, several studies rather than one. So the lower part of the figure describes how this variation of the predictor and outcome auxiliary sets it would be done in detail. And the lowercase letters in the lower part of the figure stand for individual auxiliary hypotheses. And the intersection represents the hypotheses that are not directly related to the predictor or outcome variables, but pertain to the test as a whole, such as the assumptions of the statistical model. And if I zoom in a little bit on the variation of the predictor and outcome auxiliary sets for illustration, which sort of function as the boundary conditions probe, the idea is that if either an element in the predictor or the outcome auxiliary sets is changed, while the elements in the other sets are kept constant, we can track the changes in the results to discern which set or element may be chiefly responsible for the difference. So, for example, a researcher can first keep the operationalization of their predictor variable the same, while using various different outcome variables. In the next step, a similar diversification procedure can be applied to the variable that was kept constant in the previous step. And this time, the variable that was being varied in the previous step can be kept constant. And if a theoretical claim survives all these steps without being falsified, it can be said that it is severely tested and largely corroborated. But when we face mixed results, by following this procedure, we also would be able to relatively isolate the effects of different auxiliary assumptions, like different individual elements in these sets, and to see if the main hypothesis is conditional on including or excluding certain particular assumptions like operationalizations. So this is pretty much the main idea. So this is one strategy to maximize the informativity of individual replications. There might be others, but this is a strategy to approximate to a maximally severe hypothesis test in the form of a battery of interconnected tests. So I guess it's a nice place to stop, and I will give the floor back to Ellen and Sarah, and thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Duygu. So now we will transition to the commentary. So I'm happy to introduce Sarah Volz, who is a PhD candidate in the Department of Psychology here at the University of Minnesota, and who has been deeply involved in our Many Faces of Reproducibility initiative. She will be offering a commentary on the presentation. Sarah, the floor is yours.
Hi, we'll see if I can figure out how to correctly share what I want to share on Zoom. Okay, that needs to go away. There we go. Okay, hopefully you all can see my screen and everything.
Yep, looks good.
Looks well. All right, excellent. So I very much enjoyed this talk. I was really interested in it because it has very strong implications for how we actually conduct science, which as somebody who's an empirical researcher, this is really relevant and important to me. And it's not just important to me. These are all things that sort of in the last 10 years have really moved to the forefront of psychology research, have really been concerning to a lot of researchers and resulted in a lot of major, really large replication projects, as well as a lot of commentaries and papers thinking about what we can learn from these different replication projects. So this has really represented a large investment of time and resources and publication pages and stuff. In the last several years, we've really been concerned about replication. And I think one of the relevant concerns is sort of this idea of like, are these replications informative? Are they telling us something useful and meaningful. And if we're trying to have informative replications, which I think we would want, what should they look like, which is this talk engages with. And so, there's this very key idea that replication is informative to the extent that it tests various auxiliary hypotheses associated with an original study. And there's a proposal essentially for how we should engage in informative replications, where we do a study, we do close replications, then we're systematically manipulating components of these auxiliary hypotheses and doing close replications of those. And then hopefully that allows us to come to some sort of consensus on these auxiliary hypotheses and the main hypothesis of interest. But I had a few questions sort of that came up for me as I was listening to this talk and reading its associated papers and such. And one of them is something that was engaged with a little bit, but it's this idea of sort of how should social scientists work to identify and define the auxiliary hypotheses in complex systems, like understanding human behavior. And so what are like the rational criteria that we should use in sort of selecting from the huge range of potential causal influences on a particular effect, particularly when kind of our theories might be relatively ambiguous, and how do we avoid that sort of misspecification that would be really problematic. And then another kind of key question that I had was how the functioning of science would look different under this proposed framework when compared to existing approaches. And so I really appreciated the kind of theoretical approach to the development of this framework. But when I look at this framework and I think about it in relation to existing psychology studies and particularly published psychology work, how we sort of package things for publication, I actually see a lot of similarities. So kind of my little gestalt for how, a typical social psych paper and lots of other areas of psychology have similar sort of models, is you have a study 1 that shows an effect, you have a study 2 where you show the effect again, typically in, maybe a slightly different population or with a larger sample or something like that, but it's not hugely different. And then you have study 3, maybe a couple study 3 type studies where you look at mediators or moderators of an effect, or you're testing competing or alternative explanations for this effect. Then maybe another study where you're looking at this with like a different type of design, where you're switching to a longitudinal design or experimental manipulation of something that was just observed before. You're looking at a community or clinical sample or something like that. And so when I sort of look at this in the context of stability probes and boundary condition probes and stuff, you're like, okay, well, like, is that sort of functionally what these are doing without using that language and without explicitly identifying these auxiliary hypotheses? And so just because this is just kind of what I was, how I think about that, how these papers are often published, what I did was I just went to JPSP, Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, which is sort of one of the major journals in personality and social psychology. And I just picked a random issue from a random volume and opened like the first 4 papers there. And every single one of them pretty much had this framework where we've got, something like 4 to 8 studies on all these different topics where they're doing this thing of showing an effect and then testing various, mediators, moderators, alternative explanations, testing it in different samples, whatever, stuff like that. And so I think what emerges here really is that I have this concern that the proposed framework isn't sufficiently different from what psychologists were previously doing. So these were all from, a 2015 publication, but, looks like it in other years as well. And so I think I have this kind of concern maybe that the research that used a very, what seems like at least superficially a very similar framework led to this replication crisis, or work that has now turned into this replication crisis. And if using this approach led to work that has a replication crisis, how is it going to help get us out of it? But in thinking of this question of the sort of the functioning of science, there's probably other things we could think of as well, right? And not just sort of like what publications look like, but also, you know, grant funding or lab organization type things that this kind of framework might have implications for. And just because I don't want to pick on any of these papers, because it's better to pick on your own work, I actually happen to have what I think is a pretty good example of sort of testing of some of these auxiliary hypotheses from my own work, looking at cognitive load and eating. And so there are various hypotheses about how cognitive load might affect eating, lots of different possible designs and operationalizations and things. So there's tons of different associated auxiliary hypotheses. And in our lab, we actually ran a series of 8 studies where we were really systematically manipulating things like different designs and stimuli and means of responding and type of responding and social context and how long they were engaged in tasks and things that you might think of as, you know, like not being really important, but we were getting very conflicting patterns of results. And so this is, I think, another example of this space where it's like, we're just maybe really not good at identifying what all of these important auxiliary hypotheses should be. You know, we were lucky that, you know, in this space, right, even though we weren't able to come to a really clear conclusion about the main hypothesis of interest, or even really many of the auxiliary hypotheses, just kind of this abundance of evidence that like something's going on, but it's a wreck and we don't know what, was enough that like we could put it out there so that other people could engage with this work. But you know, it's messy, and I think it's something we're not necessarily very good at just yet. And then kind of just as a concluding issue, I think there's this question of what issues related to replication does this kind of proposed framework address, and which are set aside, and sort of is this kind of going to be a sufficient means of you know, addressing ideas about sort of the utility of replication. And I think in particular, contrasting it with some of the alternative approaches, particularly something like pre-registration, where that's really more focused on you know, issues with like inappropriate statistical testing, or trying to address some publication bias through things like registered reports and stuff like that. And how the proposed framework, you know, might interact with these, support some of these, or, you know, whether it can overcome some of these other limitations and stuff too. So these were kind of my main thoughts. I'd love to hear people's reflections and other questions. And I guess we'll turn it back over to Duygu for comments.
Yes, thank you very much, Sarah. I appreciate those questions and your comments, especially from the working scientist perspective. I just wanted to remind our audience that we're going to give Duygu the first opportunity to respond to Sarah's commentary. But after that, the floor will be open for Q&A. So what I would encourage you to do is either raise your hand, at which point we can work through the queue and I can have you ask your question directly. If you would like to put your question in the chat, you may do that as well. Alternatively, you could also click on the Q&A button within the Zoom toolbar and ask your question that way. Any of these are fine. So please go ahead and begin formulating your questions or raising your hand. And Duygu, let's go back to you for reactions and responses to Sarah's commentary.
Thank you very much, Ellen. So I'm not checking Q&A right now. So like, let me begin first by thanking Sarah a lot for also like the amount of work you seem to put into this and the very valuable feedback from, as Ellen said, the perspective of the practicing scientist. So yeah, many important and interesting points. I tried to make notes of all, I hope. So the first question, how to identify auxiliary hypotheses, and are there rational criteria, and how to avoid misspecification. We are trying to, like, I'm just including myself, I say it's sort of sharing a common cause, but let's say scientists are trying to maximize the informativity of their sort of research practices via rational methods as much as this is possible, or like to the utmost extent that this is possible, if sort of they share such a perspective. But this, of course, has limits. So there are certain areas of scientific research that we can almost axiomatize, almost turn into an algorithmic procedure so that we can have a rational protocol. And there are some other areas which may be sometimes very intimately connected to these, but way less prone to such an algorithmization, if I may say so. And this question, so how to identify, I would say not just the auxiliary hypotheses to test, but like how to identify the most problematic auxiliary hypotheses, or the ones that would be the most worth testing. So this question is one of those. So I doubt that there is a rational strategy for how to go about this, but lack of rational procedure doesn't mean there's no reasonable way, of course, or there are no like justified ways. Obviously, we sort of like scientists share, like working in a field, share certain background knowledge and assumptions. So there's, let's say, the theory of measurement in the field, like has certain sort of areas covered relatively well, and maybe weak in sort of other areas, and so on. So the working scientist would, I sort of assume, as in a way, Duem actually like sort of suggested, would have a certain sense, a good sense of which auxiliary hypotheses would be more problematic. But having said that, the best way to approach this question would be through an adversarial sort of setting, because like everybody has sort of their cognitive blind spots, and however we can be critical of other people's research, we are assumably quite blind to our own sort of theoretical commitments or methodological commitments, and sort of any other kind of other bias that we might sort of introduce into the research. So of course, the best would be to have others point out what would be the most problematic sort of elements in their auxiliary hypotheses or in their sort of scientific model. So that is sort of one way to approach this, I guess, like sort of relying on the critical community of science. But the second question is not the same. So how to avoid misspecification? So the whole strategy I'm proposing is for the sort of worst case scenario, actually, where we really have a strong problem of misspecification, although I argued that it is logically impossible to completely prevent misspecification. Of course, like this comes in degrees. And my strategy is actually to embrace the risk of misspecification and to learn from it. So the whole idea is that you cannot prevent misspecification, and maybe like you should, of course, try to specify your scientific model as best as possible. but the idea is to learn from misspecification problems. So how can we utilize replications to learn the most from misspecification problems? Because like however well you try to control your sort of experimental procedure, or however well versed in the theoretical background of your research you are, science always sort of progresses through discovering new stuff. And one of the sort of best venues to discover new stuff is, of course, through identifying these misspecification problems. So the whole idea is not to like have misspecification issues as a huge sort of roadblock or like end of the road, like, oh, we have a replication failure, or the worst, we have a replication failure, but we have no idea what it means. So we can use it. So the idea is to use it informatively to the best. And the second question, how to socially coordinate to do this. So this is not something I talked about, because I just focused on the methodological and as much as possible the logical aspects of the problem. But of course, like there's a social backdrop to the feasibility of all this, of course. So if I like sort of try to expand my argument a little bit in that direction, so I won't propose a whole social organization model of science to like facilitate this kind of research, but one sort of immediate venue of expansion can be to sort of define the boundary conditions probe as involving a competing theories probe. So something like this. In this, the social organization of science would be extremely crucial. So the idea is that if your scientific model has certain auxiliary assumptions, which are not if certain auxiliary assumptions are missing in your scientific model, but are specified in a competing or an alternative scientific model in somebody else's theory, this by itself deserves explanation. So this is one immediate sort of way in which the social nature of science can be utilized. So this would be a good way to start identifying potential problematic auxiliary hypotheses to test. And the second idea, going a little bit further, would be to organize sort of replication attempts, or maybe collective replication attempts, in the form of adversarial collaborations. Not maybe all of them, but some in the form of adversarial collaborations. So this was one of the ideas that we defended in the paper on scientific replications framework, because like the worst case scenario where we have a huge misspecification problem and we have, let's say, very little means to improve our single hypothesis test, let's say. So in that worst case scenario, we usually have contested literatures, like let's say people sort of devise certain tests to sort of test their like sort of answers to a particular theoretical question in a way that doesn't share with the alternatives many of their theoretical or methodological or statistical assumptions. So to put it like in a more sort of normal language, so many research questions are quite contested in psychology at the moment, and also like probably other fields as well. Like a simple relationship between two variables can be very difficult to ascertain despite years of research. Something like I don't know, exposure to violence in media and aggressive behavior, something like this, and you can have like tons of studies without reaching a certain sort of conclusion on the phenomenon. And what happens in those cases is usually that people cannot decide on cannot agree on or reach a consensus on theoretical and methodological sort of disagreements. So they have deep disagreements about such issues, like, for example, everybody uses their own pet measures and sort of undermines the measures of the others and so on. So the experiments talk across sort of each other. They don't accumulate knowledge. So adversarial collaborations, for example, would be extremely useful in such contexts. So not forcing, but let's say encouraging the contesting parties to agree on a research design, to agree on certain auxiliary assumptions, to specify certain parts of their scientific model together, would really advance, I think, field's knowledge, like background knowledge in terms of like sort of common auxiliary hypotheses quite significantly. And what I think sort of the last two questions, like if I begin with the first one, you asked if we don't already do this, so we have like a sort of similar categorization of different steps in a sort of model study, and which seem to be doing what I called stability probe and the boundary conditions probe. So I would first say, yeah, like there is some similarity to the reasoning behind sort of this kind of research design and the thing I'm proposing. Of course, they're not like completely speaking different languages, though the idea is very similar, like epistemically, I mean, but like I try to maximize the informativity of tests, especially in the worst case scenarios, like contexting literatures, but also it is a much more versatile framework. For example, we can also talk about the limitations of self-replications, which are the case, like, for example, in those papers, because another kind of auxiliary hypothesis is, of course, things like experimenter's bias. And you will be able to conceptualize all kinds of such issues within a simple, the same model. So that's one of the advantages. And the last question was how difficult did it? Yeah, sorry. So just a little add-on to the last sort of answer. So my guiding question, I guess mentioned it several times in the slides. My guiding question would be to ask to like each such paper how difficult it is to provide alternative explanations of the results, which would refer to certain auxiliary assumptions of the test. So if it is, after all of those studies, if it is still not very difficult, then we simply have a misspecification problem, although there might be lots of quite impressive studies that have been done. So my sort of heuristic test would be to ask this question to the paper. So do you also mentioned, yeah, QRPs and publication bias, and let me just sort of conclude by mentioning those. Yeah, one of the main functions of replications, which I didn't mention, is of course to test for QRPs. Like if the original study involved any questionable research practices such as p-hacking, like selective reporting of conditions or selective reporting of outcomes, or even selective reporting of whole studies, or harking, like hypothesizing after the facts are in, and stuff like that. Yes. Like, of course, one way to answer this question might be to just say that, like, when we are like talking on the theoretical plane about how to increase the informativity of tests, we are like assuming or bracketing the whole sort of topic of people's intentions and motivations. So that might be one way to go about it. So we are assuming the best intentions or best practice. But on the other hand, if I'm not like overstretching, I think QRPs can also be formulated, or potential QRPs might also be formulated in the form of auxiliary hypotheses. So using the same framework. So I don't think they would require a totally different conceptualization of replications. But I also think that like QRPs shouldn't be too common in a literature anyway. So like it would be it would be weird to try to if the main point of replications was to test for QRPs, because then we would have a huge problem to talk about anyway. But publication bias, no, I don't think actually my framework involves anything in that direction. So this is something that I don't have. I don't think you can use replications to test for publication bias, but of course I'm open for alternative suggestions, like if you think this can be doable. But yeah, so to wrap it up, I think that QRPs can be included in the functions of replications in my sort of conceptual framework, but maybe not the publication bias element. So yeah, that's so far it.
All right, thank you, Duygu. So I will go ahead and start in on the questions that are coming in. So one of the first questions was about communicating with you further about this work. So what we've done is put the URL to your personal website that you have, which has your papers and other things there. So people will be able to know how to contact you and see also some of the work that you cited during the presentation. The first question that we have comes from the Q&A, and it's from Henry Reineken. What is a good term for a result with high statistical severity, conditional on a set of auxiliary hypotheses? I'm assuming all calculations are done correctly. No p hacking, for example. Is statistically significant misleading? Does it imply an unwarranted finality?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So I'm trying to guess if the question is rhetorical or not, because like I'm first happy to see Henry here. I know him like through social media. And there is a possibility that he has read one of the papers I actually cited in one of the slides, and that paper is really about this question, but that might not be the case. So I will just have a little reference to what we argue in that paper. So we are actually defending significant or insignificant decisions which are like really notorious and came under heavy criticism recently. And this is the paper titled The Epistemic and Pragmatic Function of Dichotomous Decisions in Statistical Hypothesis Testing. So there we argued that, of course, like any kind of dichotomous decision you take on the basis of a statistical hypothesis test would be conditional on the truth, or like, let's say maybe not say truth, but the validity of several statistical, but as well as higher level auxiliary hypotheses. So like the whole logical sort of grounding of reaching significant, insignificant sort of decisions depends for its reliability on the sort of logical strength of your scientific inference chain, basically. So that was the whole idea. So what is a good term for a result with high statistical severity, but still conditional on a set of auxiliary hypotheses? I cannot come up with a good term for this, right, just off the top of my head, but I would call, like, if I understand the question correctly, I would call such a finding sort of the sort of identification of an effect which corresponds conceptually to a much smaller sort of area than area of, let's say, boundary conditions, or like of conceptual space or generalizability, I would say, than the original hypothesis that was being tested. So if there's high statistical severity, we can maybe at least assume that we have a stable observation. We have definitely observed an effect. But if the upper levels are sort of shaky. Probably we have not observed what we predicted to observe exactly, although we can be sure that we have observed something. Does it make sense?
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense to me. Probably further follow-up would be needed. Yes, and Henry says that he does understand that. Thank you, Henry. So let's go to another question. I've got one from Nathan. Let's see here. Oh, Nathan, let's see. Janet, can you give Nathan the ability to speak?
Hi, are you able to hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead, Nathan.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, thanks for the talk. This might be a little bit long, but I'll try to just narrow it down to like the essential details. So I have a particular case that I want to present to you from psychology to see how it fits in this overall picture. What I'm thinking about is, at the very beginning, you're mentioning, these sort of like inhibitors to replication, like we need our theories to be falsifiable. We need to mitigate underdetermination or something like this. And so I'm not engaging with some of the finer details, but just this overall picture, and I want to see how this case fits in on your view. So I'm interested in implicit bias, and that's the science behind that has been a subject of controversy. One of the models that was introduced in 2014 was introduced by Jan de Houwer, and this model, it's with respect to the previous models, the dual process models, there is a significant, I would say, underdetermination. And also this model is not straightforwardly falsifiable. And I don't know that because I'm a philosopher who's looking at theories and trying to assess for these things. I know that because he says that in the article where he introduces this model. So the merits of the model are that it's introducing this new research program, and it allows for this new reinterpretation, propositional reinterpretation of old data. So it's got this heuristic value. It's going to make some testable predictions. And it also might be useful for some sort of like instrumental purpose. Like there are some meta-analyses that are comparing interventions on implicit bias that are, some of these interventions are inspired by a propositional model, others are inspired by or presume a dual process model, and which one's more effective for this purpose, this particular aim. So given all that, what I guess what I'm saying is there a case like this where you might think that there's some kind of value trade-off? Okay, maybe explicitly falsifiability isn't what we're really worried about at this time, and maybe we're not that worried about underdetermination. Maybe you can explain everything with a dual process model that you could also explain with the propositional model. Or is this just bad science on your view? Or, is this just, it just seems, it's like I said, it's not, it wouldn't be news to de Houwer to tell him that, his theory is not falsifiable and that it's underdetermined. He openly acknowledges this in the article. So yeah, that's my what I want to present.
Yeah, I mean, thanks a lot for the question. So actually, I saw also like lots of debates about the implicit bias literature, also lots of negative takes. But like, to be extremely honest, I haven't been following that debate very closely. I should have done so, really. So like, just correct me if I'm wrong or I need like more details. Just fill me in. So on a, like, let's say, principle level, I mean, the general sort of consensus, I guess, in philosophy of science is that falsifiability is not a name that is like sort of unconditional, because like if they value falsifiability in the first place, like many people don't value falsifiability at all, but like we know at least from Lakatos's work, like after Popper, that actually like theories or like scientific models are quite big structures, which have elements that have different sort of degrees of falsifiability. So that this is definitely not a one or none phenomenon. So usually, if Lakatos is right, the inner theoretical core of a sort of theoretical framework would be or could be unfalsifiable. And sort of the whole structure would be falsifiable through its more peripheral elements, like through, let's say, the mediation of its more peripheral elements. So the idea is that sort of the axiomatic parts, something like dual process models versus propositional models, I guess you said. So something like this can be in the theoretical core of a scientific model, and then it will meet sort of what is traditionally called the tribunal of experience, only through the whole sort of nebula of auxiliary hypotheses it has, so not like a direct impact from experience. So like, cut it short, like there's nothing inherently problematic about that, I think. So when it comes to falsifiability, I guess we can even also like go further and say that a research program doesn't have to be falsifiable from the start as well. So like we might sort of have, we might sort of give or bestow sort of new ideas a certain period of grace, definitely. And Paul Mail used to call this getting credit from the bank. So if, let's say, a new idea is not directly testable or has some problems in that area, we can still sort of give them some time to mature their sort of measurement related assumptions, experimental models, and so on, or to like sort of further articulate and specify the theory. So that also is one of the things, but of course, all depends on what you do with that borrowed credit from the bank. So this is where falsifiability sort of indirectly comes back into the picture. So if your model or sort of research program goes on for a very long time without producing clearly testable predictions, or like sort of having vague or very insevere tests of its so-called predictions, and if the sort of authors, the scientists sort of behind the research program are sort of assuming a defensive attitude when it comes to like sort of their boundary conditions or limitations and so on. So if they're, for example, meeting all kinds of criticisms, which would mostly be directed at their auxiliary assumptions, by sort of inventing new auxiliary assumptions in a way that their sort of research program would absorb and sort of assimilate those criticisms, but maybe also by becoming less testable in the process or less severely tested in the process. So there, where the problem becomes way more serious, I would say. But you also mentioned interventions. So like the idea, if I understood correctly, was like you are already like, let's say, developing interventions on the basis of a theory. And if interventions work, why bother so much with the truth of the theory? But when interventions don't work, and some of these won't work, we have exactly the same problem. Like we have the problem of underdetermination. So is it because the model behind the intervention was false, or was there something wrong with the intervention itself, with its design or implementation? And again, you can have a defensive attitude, sort of safeguarding your model and always blaming the particulars of the interventions. So I guess that's also like a very similar discussion. So I would look at how actually the original authors respond to criticisms. If there are no serious criticism around, of course, all is fine. Even if you don't have yet like highly severely tested results. But if there are criticisms, and I would look at how they respond to those criticisms.
Okay, we've got one.
Does it answer your question, do you think?
Yeah, I think it is, but I also think we've got to move on because we're almost out of time. And there's one last question that you'll have a chance to answer really quickly before we finish. This is from Chris Schuck. Do you think it's feasible to develop a comprehensive taxonomy for the many types of auxiliary hypotheses that tend to be associated with various kinds of studies and claims across different experimental setups and topics, along with a database of case examples accompanied by all their possible alternative hypotheses, rather than just ad hoc in the occasional article by you and a few others? Seems like having a lot of concrete examples and scenarios at hand could be very instructive for those beginning to appreciate these issues.
I mean, thanks a lot for the question. Yeah, not just for people who are beginning to appreciate these issues, but like for whole fields in general. Yeah, I think it's an extremely valuable project for each field, for each or each subfield. Like just as we develop measures, we should, I guess, have sort of common basis of the most common or most problematic auxiliary assumptions that are shared across many studies. And this is definitely empirical work, like serious empirical work. And I think it is definitely feasible. So we can develop like a comprehensive taxonomy for the many types of auxiliary hypotheses that would be associated with studies. And like across context, as you said, but this would be like very local. We shouldn't aim here for a very general taxonomy, I would say. So being local pays here, because like each field, they have their like own problems and challenges. It should be as local as it would be meaningful, I guess. And like it was also one of, again, I will just mention Mail, because it was one of his sort of latest or last projects to develop a comprehensive taxonomy of all important auxiliary hypotheses in psychology. And he didn't live up to realize that project, actually. But with baby steps, I'm involved in a few projects right now, mostly in health psychology, projects which aim to do really that, but on a more like local scale, to develop a comprehensive taxonomy of the auxiliary hypotheses. So I'm like also new to like the empirical researching this question now. I will see how it goes, but I really desire as sort of a midterm research goal myself to contribute to the development of such taxonomies, maybe hopefully beginning with health psychology and doing this for other areas.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Duygu, for a wonderful presentation and for your answers to the questions. Thank you, Sarah, for your perceptive commentary. And thank you all who were able to join us today and for questions and reflections that you offered as well. We look forward to seeing you at a future installation of this event, which will pick up again in the spring semester with 2 more events. And until then, everybody take care, stay safe, and we'll see you soon.